Yesterday, I reread one of my favorite novels by Hugh MacLennan, The Watch That Ends the Night. This is the most recent McGill Queen's University Press edition. This is the one I read. This is the one I typically read. But I also have a first Canadian edition from 1959 hardcover. I have this Macmillan paperback. And I have this Signet paperback edition from 1961, The Passions and Politics of a Generation That Was Young in the 30s. The Watch That Ends the Night is considered Hugh MacLennan's Lost Generation novel. It's set primarily in the 1930s, and it deals with a number of main characters, the four main ones being Catherine, a young woman who has had her condition from birth that could kill her at any moment. She's been told that she should never marry, never have children. She goes ahead and marries and has a child in the 1930s. She goes against her mother's wishes, attends McGill University. She decides to live her life to the fullest, even if she only gets 10 years. Then we have George, one of her neighbors from this small town. They were in love as teenagers. He wanted to go to McGill with Catherine, but his parents and his aunt specifically wanted him to continue going to this other kind of prestigious old country style school in the English tradition. Then his family lost all their money and he couldn't go to university right away, and he had to work and ended up attending the University of Toronto. So he lost touch with Catherine. And it wasn't until the 1930s in Montreal that George and Catherine met again. Unfortunately, by the time they meet, Catherine has married the surgeon Jerome. Jerome is haunted by the things that he did during the First World War, and in a way he's trying to make up to it through his work as a doctor. Unfortunately, he gets tangled up with the Communist Party there in Montreal and basically ruins his career. He ends up having an affair with a nurse named Nora, who is another main character. Nora herself is married, and Jerome is married to Catherine. This novel is set primarily in the midst of the Great Depression in Montreal. It's told through a lot of flashbacks. The characters are struggling both with the events of the Depression, with the political volatility of the 1930s, and with the past First World War. They come together in the same intellectual circle. George has been working as a teacher at a kind of out-of-the-way, not very prestigious, kind of old-style school for boys. It's called Waterloo. A lot of the teachers there are Englishmen who spend their summers in England and still consider that the home country. It's in this atmosphere that George and Catherine meet again after so many years. They haven't seen each other since they were teenagers, and Catherine went off to McGill. She is married to Jerome by this time, and they have a daughter named Sally. Politics end up erupting in Montreal. Jerome is caught in the midst of a riot at a communist event. He ruins his career, gets fired from the hospital that he works at, and he decides the only thing he can do is leave his terminally ill wife and 6-year-old daughter to go to Spain to assist with blood transfusions in the Civil War there. Unfortunately, the last his wife Catherine sees of him, he is up on the deck of a boat, and out walks the nurse Nora beside him, who Jerome has been having an affair with. It's not long after that they hear that Jerome has been brutally tortured and killed by Nazis during the war. So these events happen kind of throughout the novel in flashbacks, but the novel actually opens 12 years after these events, after they've heard that Jerome has been killed. And George, by this time, is working as a prominent Canadian radio host. He's also a professor at a university, and within the first few pages, George gets a call, and it's a voice he hasn't heard in 12 years, and it's Jerome. Jerome has indeed survived. He's tried to get word out, but the Nazis sent him to a concentration camp. He was in Germany when the Russians rolled in. The Russians took him because he was a doctor, and then he ended up in China, and the Chinese let him go to Hong Kong when he became ill. And then after all these years, he's finally made his way back to Montreal, looking for his wife to see if she's indeed survived over a decade, and looking for his daughter Sally. The problem? George and Catherine have been married for 9 years, and Sally now thinks of George as her father. There is a lot in this novel about coming to terms with the past. The attitude towards the past is kind of nostalgic, but it's a wary nostalgia. There's a distaste for the past, but at the same time, it's kind of, this is the way things were. The Second World War was kind of a turning point for Canada. If you know anything about Canadian history, at least the way that it's taught in schools, you'll know that Canada symbolically waited a couple of days after Britain declared war to declare war herself in order to symbolize that she was independent. In the First World War, when Britain declared war, Canada automatically went to war. There was no separate declaration, but by the time the Second World War rolled around, Canada was more independent in that way. And this novel really showcases kind of the changing of the guard in a way. Waterloo, the small college that George teaches at in the 1930s, is very British, is made up of Englishmen who don't really feel that Canada is home. They feel as if they're stuck in the middle of nowhere. They're only there because it's a job. They all go running back to England for the summer. But by the time the late 1940s and 1950s roll around, Waterloo has quite a different reputation, and it's taught by mostly Canadians. The Englishmen have gone back to England. Very early on page 4, George is reflecting on everything that has happened. Beside this quote I wrote, MacLennan dwells on this again and again. In a lot of MacLennan's novels, he seems unable to come to terms with the Second World War. He seems stuck on that point, which is very understandable. But here, George narrates, "These post-war students seemed to me a new breed on earth. They were so much freer in their souls than we'd ever been, and so much easier in their emotions. Also, unless the world goes crazy again, they were luckier, for not one of them could remember the Depression, or what it had been like when Hitler was the most powerful man in the world. Not one of them was corroded by the knowledge that nobody wanted them." He's also describing Montreal in a very nostalgic way. He says, "This pale twilight bathing the city erased time, as if the past was quickly disappearing. But at the same time, there's a lot of wariness towards the future. A little bit later on, it was gone now that we were learning to live like New Yorkers." There's very much resistance to the future as well. "Must one remember, or is it better to forget? I had the feeling that history itself would disappear. What a terrible lesson in geography my generation has learned. Those place names of our lost passions and fears. I felt like a survivor." And Jerome, of course, is the past coming back to haunt these characters in the present. They're happy to see him, but at the same time, many of them wish that he had actually died. One of the first things George says to Jerome when he hears his voice is, "Nobody has had a single word from you since 1939. After 12 years in which a war had been fought, and the British Empire had crumbled, and Europe had become like the secession states of ancient Greece, and America had turned into a new Rome. There's been a lot of water under the bridge since Jerome disappeared, since the World War." In fact, part of the reason that some of the characters are wary of his return is not only the effect it's going to have on Catherine, who has such a poor heart and to whom Jerome was basically the love of her life, but we have an additional minor character who's concerned because he himself was a member of the Communist Party in the 1930s. He associated with Nora, he associated with Jerome. He was at a meeting the night a riot occurred, and Jerome ended up on the front page with his fist in the air. This additional character has been working for the Canadian government, and although he's been quite honest about his previous communist roots, he's worried that the effect it would have on his career, on his life, if the Americans were to find out through Jerome that he himself had been associated with the communists. Keep in mind, it is the late 40s, it is the early 50s at this point. And, well, you don't want to be a communist in the United States. So obviously a large part of this novel is death. The title itself, The Watch That Ends the Night. The night, of course, is life. And basically a lot of the characters are waiting for death. Now this has a double meaning. I think it's accurately portrayed near the end. It's talking about Catherine's illness, how it's mentioned a number of times throughout the novel how her illness is like a sword hanging over her, and she's felt the point of it a number of times, and it can drop and kill her at any moment, and everybody's just watching and waiting for that. But the sword was still over her as the bomb was over the world, but she lived, and that summer was the richest we ever had together. One of the key themes is about allowing Catherine to live her death. Making the most of the time that she has, not getting sad and dwelling on it, but really enjoying the evening of her life. It's almost as if a death has already occurred. There's one point where a character asks, do you get the feeling that time stopped in 1939? And it's as if in old Canada, an old way of living, an old way of life died at that point, and things shifted, and a new way of existing basically came to be. There's a sense that this old way of being, this old way of living has changed not only the country but the individual characters. Then a man discovers in dismay that what he believed to be his identity is no more than a tiny canoe at the mercy of an ocean. One final thought on this novel. I noticed it while I was reading Return of the Sphinx the other week. MacLennan seems to have been a fan of Hemingway. I notice Hemingway coming up subtly again and again in his pieces. In this novel, he actually directly mentions Hemingway. I'm going to see if I can find it. George has been reading something written by a friend of his, and he reflects, but the post-war Connolly was more seriously a casualty of Ernest Hemingway. He had entered Hitler's war so steeped in a farewell to arms that the Australians, Englishmen, and Canadians he wrote about all talked like Italians trying to think in English, just as he, in his ordinary life, tried to talk like a character out of a Hemingway short story. He had showed me his script, and I had not known what to say about it, for I liked and respected the man. You couldn't call his novel a plagiarism. He was such a prisoner of the master that his script read like a parody of the later Hemingway parodying the Hemingway of the 20s. Maybe I'm stretching things a little bit, but to me Jerome seems almost like a character out of a Hemingway novel. He is the warrior with a weak side who has gone off to fight in the war. He's gone to Spain, he's been through hell, and he ends up losing everything in the process. I would be interested to read through all of MacLennan's novels and kind of track them for references to Hemingway, because I don't know a whole lot about MacLennan's reading life, but I'm going to bet that he read quite a bit of Hemingway. The Watch That Ends the Night is considered Hugh MacLennan's best novel by many. Not my favorite, but definitely one of my favorites. I would encourage you to check it out. Perhaps it's MacLennan's most approachable novel for a new reader. Check out The Watch That Ends the Night, read some Canlit,